Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor-in-chief. This is a first in a series of virtual conversations we're hosting on a new anthology, Secularizing Buddhism, New Perspectives on a Dynamic Tradition. It's published by our friends over at Shambhala Publications, who are partnering with us on this series. So as the title suggests, this week's conversations will explore secularization as a dynamic process that's changing the way we think and talk about Buddhism, about what Buddhism is, and how we practice Buddhism in the modern world. Today's Zoom session will be recorded for anyone who is unable to attend, and we'll make it available on Tricycle's YouTube channel. The link is posted in the chat in case you want to share it with friends who can't be here, or if you want to watch it again. We are providing these events for free, so if you haven't already and would like to support Tricycle, please consider giving a donation at the link in the chat. You'll also find a link in the chat for a 30% discount on the book, which I highly recommend. I love the book. We will leave time for a Q&A at the end of this hour-long session. You can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. My guest today is Richard Payne. Richard is Yehan Numata Professor of Japanese Buddhist Studies at the Institute of Buddhist Studies at my alma mater, UC Berkeley. For over 4 decades, he has studied Tantric Buddhist practices, which led him to research the Shingon tradition in Japan. In addition to his academic research at Naokoya, the main training center for Shingon, he completed his training and was initiated as an acharya, or ajari, or many of you would just say teacher. He is also the editor of the collection of essays we'll be discussing. Again, Secularizing Buddhism, New Perspectives on a Dynamic Tradition is the book. And again, you can get a 30% discount on that book at the link in the chat. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much, James. It's good to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. Now, I'd like to start by having you tell us about the book's purpose and who it's intended for.
The collection is intended for the wide range of people, the large number of people who are interested in understanding Buddhism as it exists today, whether they are practitioners or scholars or both. My impression is that there are a lot of people who are interested in studying the Dharma, which often extends beyond practicing meditation to also reading and studying, learning about the tradition itself. And this book seeks to provide a contemporary picture, a present day picture of what it is that Buddhism is developing through, the process by which Buddhism is developing in the present moment. And the intent then is to step back a bit and allow people to be able to look at that process and be engaged in it more actively, rather than just feeling like it's something that is happening outside of their control.
Yeah, could you say something more about that, our agency and how Buddhism develops, rather than Buddhism just sort of being this thing that has been dropped on us and that just evolves on its own?
Yeah, it's very easy to fall into language of talking about Buddhism as if it were a separate thing from the totality of practitioners, the totality of adherents, the totality of people engaged with it. There are, it's all too easy to think of Buddhism as something out there that is an ongoing, transcendent entity of some kind. We inherit a lot of that kind of thinking from the 19th century, and it's very deeply embedded in our philosophic systems and in our common discourse, our common ways of talking about things. And yet, there is nothing that is Buddhism except what we do, except how we think about it, except how we engage with the existing traces and tracks of the ancestors. That's where Buddhism is alive. And it has no, it doesn't do anything. Right? we choose to understand it and to embody it and to live it in the present world. And that includes even those academics who look at it, attempt to look at it objectively because it's not their own tradition. They are still engaged with it. There's a tendency in some of the ways that religious studies people talk about traditions is to think about them as insiders versus outsiders. That there are people who are inside the tradition and there are people who are outside the tradition. And I've even seen extensive discussions about when an insider talks to an outsider, when insiders talk to insiders, and so on and so forth. This is a very, very bad metaphor for understanding what's going on with religion in the present world. There are different styles of engagement. Different people engage with the Buddhist tradition in different ways. And whether that's someone who has spent 50 years studying the tradition and practicing it, becoming initiated into it, or someone who has begun to look at YouTube videos. Those are different kinds of engagements. It's not that there are insiders and outsiders. It's not that there is something that is separating us, but rather a wide, wide range of ways in which we're all engaged with the tradition. And there is, I almost said the tradition. It is the idea that there is a tradition is how we formulate it, because we each encounter different aspects of it. You know, some people are coming with an engagement with the Pali tradition, with the Pali canon, and for them, that's the way in which the tradition exists. Other people have different kinds of engagement. So even what we mean by the tradition changes and varies depending upon our position in relationship to each other and to the objects that we identify as the tradition.
You know, you wrote the introduction to the book. You also wrote an essay that concludes the collection. Mm-hmm. You introduced us to pairings of words that you find problematic, that conceal assumptions that we're not really looking at. So I'll just give you 3 of those pairings, and maybe you could talk about them and why they're problematic. Secular versus religious, modern versus traditional, Eastern versus Western. Why are those so problematic, and what underlying assumptions do they conceal?
The first point of analysis, first point that I try to engage in introducing these concepts, is that although often presented as oppositional and as mutually exclusive, there's East, there's West, there's religious, there's secular, there's modern, there's traditional. They actually represent conceptual points on a range, on a line of that connects the two of them together. That these are dynamically connected by the fact that we think of them as pairs. That these are, when we define one, we automatically define the other. And so they're definitely interconnected. At a second point, all of these pairings tend to privilege one term over the other. So those are value judgments that are embedded in the discourse. Now, not everybody shares the same value orientations. I mean, for some people, East has a more positive value than West, or vice versa. Modern versus traditional. Some people feel that tradition is important and a value, and that the modern is not so much. And yet there are others who say the modern is what we need to do and we need to abandon the traditional. So these are necessarily connected to one another. And what we mean by one influences what we mean by the other. And there's also a tendency to privilege one over the other, to give greater value to one than to the other. And if we don't see that that's what is going on in the way that we talk about Buddhism, then certain things will follow totally unconsciously. And my hope is that the book can contribute to giving people a set of tools, not so much about secular and religious as such, but about how the two are related to each other. To think about things like oppositional pairs as the way in which we think about these things. So it isn't so much about East-West as it is about seeing how oppositional pairs work to direct our thinking.
You know, you wrote something, this is a little bit of, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but an example of what you're talking about, let's say we're looking at secular versus religious or modern versus traditional. Often people referring to themselves as secular Buddhists refer to the rhetoric of decadence, as you call it, a view of religious history in which the original rational system of ethics and self-development taught by the founder decays over time. That's an assumption a lot of us make in the contemporary world. Can you speak to that?
Yes, it's a very central part of my thinking about how we think about religion, how we think about Buddhism. The rhetoric of decadence was created in the Protestant Reformation. It was a way of portraying what we, the Protestant reformers, were doing in contrast to what they were reforming, the tradition that they were moving against in opposition to. The very notions of reform and Puritan Reformation embody this idea that there's a necessary process of decay from the founder, portrayed usually as an ethical system of self-development that has decayed under the pressures of an institutional church. And that this process of decay leads to an eventual point where it needs to be revived, it needs to be revitalized by returning to the original teachings. So this kind of idea that there's a cycle between the purity, the efficacy, the power, the authority of the original teachings and what they have decayed into, and then needing to return back to that. That cycle, that image of what religious history is about, was itself a form of part of a discourse, part of a rhetoric about how to present a convincing image of what the reformers were doing. It's not historically, objectively true. It's a way of writing history that is convincing because we've been taught it so much. So when this pattern, this idea about that religious teachings necessarily decay over time, and that we need to go back to the origin, when that's presented, it's presented as so obvious because everybody knows that image of history. Everybody has heard that way of thinking about the history of religions. And so it seems natural and becomes unquestionable. And yet there's a set of value judgments about why history is being written that way and why it's being presented that way.
You know, there's another example here of how a pairing can be misleading, modern and traditional. And we associate the modern with progressive or progressivism, and we associate the traditional with some sort of benighted or conservative or defensive posture. And I thought about it when I read that, and I thought, where in the traditional am I going to find the progressive? And interestingly, I remembered that it was the Shin Buddhists, traditional Buddhists, who were really the most progressive in many ways politically and socially in this country. For instance, same-sex marriage. The Shin Buddhists were onto that long before the culture even discussed it. And they were even performing same-sex marriages, I believe, by the 1970s. So say something about this notion of progressive and and conservative or somehow resisting modernity when we have that pairing modern and traditional?
I was struck by your use of the term traditional to describe Shin Buddhists in the United States. Mm-hmm. They are some of the most modernizing people I know. They have forms that may seem traditional, and yet part of that, the problem is how narrow our historical view tends to be. They were reforming and modernizing the tradition in the second half of the 19th century. And that's part of what I hope that people might get a perspective on, is that we inherit strains of modernization that go back into even the beginning of the 19th century. That this is not something that's brand new that has happened, since 2005 or some such. This is an ongoing process, mostly motivated by people in Asian Buddhists in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. And that movement to modernize Buddhism includes many aspects that we can consider today secular. Lay leadership. The Buddhist Churches of America, the largest Shin Buddhist tradition in the United States, is entirely lay-led, with, at the same time, a bishop in charge of the ministerial side. So temples have lay boards, right? And the lay leadership of the national organization has a lot of decision-making power. That's a very secular kind of institutional organization. So the idea that, I remember coming across a quote somewhere of people talking about Zen as traditional. There is such a gap between that characterization and the reality of what has gone on in 20th century and 21st century Zen in Japan and its adaptations here in the United States, that it just makes us unable to appreciate the reality of what other Buddhists are doing. And if anything, we all ought to feel comfortable visiting one another and appreciating the traditions that they are maintaining and the process of modernization that they're going through as well.
It's interesting because from the perspective, Alfred Bloom, I think at one point pointed out that many of the ideas or practices in Shin Buddhism or views were more compatible in so many ways with what we profess to believe in a Western democracy, if it still is, wherever it was, than the other Buddhist schools. So that's when I began reading more about it, because that's why their attitude, for instance, towards something like same-sex marriage should not be surprising. So here you refer to the tradition as dynamic, where we imagine these sort of static traditions as opposed to these modernized tendencies in what we call secular Buddhism. So that was an interesting thing to point out. So in other words, in fact, it's in the subtitle, dynamism, I think. Could you say something about that? The impression somehow that there are these static traditions, whereas others are modernizing. Is there such thing as a static tradition? I don't think so, but why don't you say something about that, since it's in the title of the book?
Right. Well, I certainly agree with you that there's no such thing as a static tradition, except how we think about it. If we allow our thinking to be unchanged, if we think of something as static, then for us it is. You'd asked me when we were in conversation earlier about my academic work. And in an important way, the awareness about that you're asking about with the question regarding tradition as dynamic connects with work on ritual, because that has often been, ritual has often been treated as kind of the archetype, the primary representative of something that is static and unchanging, that people who do ritual want to do it always exactly the same way and to not change things. But that way of talking about ritual does not match what actually happens. And in fact, much of what that talk aims to do is to give the air of age and seniority and authority to new forms. Right? Something new is created, and so you call it traditional. Right? You say, oh, we haven't really changed anything here. Last year we did it this way, but this year we're doing it this other way, but we haven't really changed anything. This is the way it's always been done. So the image of ritual as unchanging, as static, as something that is not dynamic, was kind of a turning point for me. And seeing that same way of talking about Buddhist traditions helped me to realize that that's just a way of talking about them. That other people's Buddhism is as dynamic as ours is. It may be changing in response to different factors, but it is undergoing change. And certainly from the middle of the 19th century on, so many of the changes in society, in economics, in communication have been global in scope. And so the direction of change has been influenced in many cases by the same factors. And that's where things begin to look so similar to one another in the present day.
Mm-hmm. You know, you're very conscious of the power of language, and again, the assumptions that can be concealed in words and phrases. And so you've chosen to use verbs like secularizing Buddhism and traditionalizing Buddhism. What do you mean by that, and why would we prefer that framing?
It helps, I think, to avoid the idea that there is some singular thing, traditional Buddhism, and some singular thing, secular Buddhism. Rather, that these are processes that are going on connected to one another. That as people create a secular Buddhism, they're also creating a traditional Buddhism. That their understanding of what Buddhism is and intending to either maintain the traditions and hold to it in resistance to what are seen as the losses of secularization, or to boldly move forward into a modern secular version of Buddhism, that we get caught in those two all too easily when they're reified as if they were actual entities. And in fact, both are changing and changing in relationship to one another. So to the very extent that the secularizing of Buddhism is a dynamic movement, it has no singular body of orthodoxy, there's nobody to enforce it. And I think that I've qualified that somewhere by saying, yeah, that as institutions that identify themselves as secular develop and age over time, there will come to be enforcement mechanisms as to what constitutes proper form of secular Buddhism. And if anything will create the kind of circular process of reform, that's going to be it, because then there will be people who will react against being told that their secular Buddhism is not adequate, is not proper. And either they'll move away or claim something else, or enter into an exchange, a conversation that may change both forms. I think that that was part of what was behind the choice of a verb rather than, a nominal. That these are, I think, as I said before, what this book provides is a snapshot of a current process. Right? It does not define what secular Buddhism is. It's a moment in the process of between the past and the future, and hopes to identify some of the strains and themes within that changing dynamic process.
I think the verb also, secularizing, makes it clear that there's agency here, that somebody's actually doing something, interpreting something, advancing a certain idea. So that seems to go along pretty much with your notion of agency, rather than Buddhism is this thing that is just here that is evolving on its own.
Yeah.
So you also, I think for the same reasons, when you talk about no tradition is static, you find it problematic, you find problematic the notion of preserving Asian Buddhism, this notion that it can be preserved as if it were something static. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, there's actually much of my awareness of that notion was triggered by one of my students, Natalie Cooley, who pointed out that a fair amount of the rhetoric of academic Buddhist studies is in that language of preservation, trying to hold on to, trying to keep something that is in the process of disappearing. And if we're preserving something, then it is at the very least been, it's easiest to preserve something when it's not alive anymore. That's one of the changes in natural history museums has been to move from displays that are of dead things to displays of things that are alive. And the museum in San Francisco has a display now of penguins that are alive. Is that a form of preserving them? It is, in the fact that they're now in a museum. But it is also a way of allowing us to see them as living, changing organisms who are active and doing things that we can't predict. So the language of preservation goes along with putting things in museums. And the establishment, the movement of objects, of Buddhist objects into museums has in large part been a complex one of colonialism and imperialism, and decontextualizing them from their living reality. I remember several years ago, there was a display from Koyasan at the, in Hawaii, at the museum, State Museum there. And what one of the items that was included in this display, these are national treasures from Japan. This is the first time many of them have been outside of Japan. And I, like so many of my colleagues, had experienced so much of Japanese Buddhism in old temples. And we were accustomed to seeing things with faded colors, with very soft colors. And one set of statues from one temple had recently been repainted and were in very bright greens and reds and yellows and blues. And it was perhaps the most striking piece there because it was so disturbing to my aesthetic presumptions about how Buddhism ought to be presented. And a colleague pointed out that that's how they had originally been. And that this was not a travesty of something old that had been, repainted in a garish form, but was in fact the act of the temple who had allowed these things to be seen internationally now for the first time. That this was representing their Buddhism, and it was very bright and very colorful, and not the kind of well-preserved, soft tones that I had become accustomed to in visiting temples in Japan.
I have a question about how you see Buddhism developing here or interpreted here, to add some agency to it. I think about Buddhism was adopted in China, maybe through a Taoist lens, here, maybe it came through the portal of psychology, say, at least for many.
Mm-hmm.
What is unique about its development here or in the modern world? Why is it terribly different from how it was picked up elsewhere? Is there anything unique about its Western interpretations and adaptations?
One of the things that I think is very important for us to understand is that when Buddhism was first being studied in the 19th century by Westerners, that was at the same time that psychology was developing. And that things like mental science or mind science, mind cure, that these were very, very widespread and popular movements in Western society at the time. So there's a tendency perhaps for us to think today of, Freud and Jung, but there was an awful lot going on that was focusing on mental development, of use of the mind, of the power of the mind. And that's the environment that Buddhism came into in the West. And in a very deep and profound way, it's not that Buddhism has been psychologized, although it's easy again to talk about the dynamic process in that form, but that the Buddhism that has been known in the West has always been psychological. But what has been brought into the West has been selected because it meets those forms. So it's not that we have set about to interpret something that pre-existed in a pure form, but rather the way in which it was presented in the West was already in psychological terms, was already in terms of the mind and its powers, the mind and its ability to affect change. And that's the result of a history of things going back into the 19th century in Asia. I just finished working on Kate Crosby's book on esoteric Theravada, and she has a very, very important chapter in there that discusses the colonial context for the development of modern Buddhism in Southeast Asia. It's another Shambhala book that I would hope that people will take advantage of, the ability that it provides for us to understand our own history.
If you hear my dog, I'm very sorry. He's running a bit. You also refer to the effect or the impact of neoliberalism or capitalism on our understanding of Buddhism. You go so far as to say that students become not students, but customers. What do you mean by that?
That, I think, is an unavoidable part of our context in today's society. That, for one thing, I would separate neoliberalism and capitalism, because capitalism is a system, economic system of exchange, and neoliberalism is an ideology. It's a way of thinking about human existence. And in the neoliberal view, we're individualized subjects whose engagement with the world is basically as consumers. And to the extent that the framework of the self-help movement and of popular psychology have molded the presentation of Buddhism, it has been molded into a form in which the relationship is between a consumer and a provider. And it's very different from the donor monastic relationship. As a donor, one does not determine what it is that is taught, does not contribute to that. And even if it's a very unconscious process, people who are presenting Buddhism are responsive to their audience. I'm not saying that they're manipulative. I'm not saying that they're malevolent. I'm not saying that they're doing this consciously. But to the extent that certain things are responded to more positively than other things, lead to those things being emphasized. I think the simplest example of that is that when I was a young student of Buddhism, the view of Buddhism was still largely conditioned by Schopenhauer. The kind of nihilistic view of Buddhism that we were going to exterminate our egos because that was the source of all ill involvement with the world, and that there was an attempt to, and as a consequence, Buddhism was viewed very negatively. And you do still see that in some cases with people having difficulty with the idea of no self. That negative view of Buddhism as a kind of downer religion that emphasizes suffering can be contrasted with the present emphasis so much on Buddhism as key to achieving true and real and lasting and permanent happiness. Suffering versus happiness, which one has greater appeal in the present world? There aren't a lot of people pushing the notion that Buddhism is all about suffering and that you have to realize your suffering as an end in itself, but rather when that's brought into conversation, it's as a key to achieving happiness. So the very emphasis between suffering and happiness has shifted towards happiness because I think that that's what people respond to. Those are the kinds of things they want to hear. And as a consequence, it molds the way in which Buddhism is being presented in the world.
Well, do you think that it might also be that you consider the teachers who came here in the mid-20th century and who were teaching students who had until then been unaware of what Buddhism was exactly, and they wanted to meet them where they were, and they taught in a way that and used forms that Westerners, say, or Americans anyway, could understand. Isn't there sort of a place for that rather than simply delivering to customers what they want, delivering something to them in a way they can understand?
Yes, I think that that's adds an important nuance to what I was trying to say before, that this wasn't simply a passive process of, filling holes in the stock of religious teachings available on the shelves, but rather an active intent of conveying the teachings. So as I say, some of it was unconscious. That is, it was not, well, what will sell? How do I promote my workshop? How do I get another book published? What topic can I promote that will be of appeal to a larger audience? That is one, that's not the entirety of what was going on. As you point out, teachers came with a very sincere intent of conveying the message and therefore needed to adapt to how to reach their audience. The way in which Shunryu Suzuki met his audience of San Francisco hippies by moving out of the Zen temple in San Francisco and locating in a different location and creating a new way of talking about Zen in interaction with them. It's not, as I said, it's not malevolent, it's not malicious, it's a way of communicating and knowing how to communicate and realizing how that best happens.
You mentioned happiness as this goal, as opposed to, a future lifetime someone gives to the monastery in hope of accumulating merit and having a more propitious rebirth. If as many people in this society believe that or simply cannot adopt that belief of future lifetimes, they simply cannot and would not. I mean, it would be dishonest to themselves, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't then the goal be well-being, or what could it be otherwise? Human flourishing, eudaimonia, that is often used. Many people use that, or being responsive rather than reactive, say. I mean, there are a lot of different ways of putting it, being a kinder, better person, and so forth. What else could it be if they're not adopting these other beliefs, say in rebirth, or they understand rebirth, say metaphorically, and karma metaphorically, psychologically perhaps, or they understand it through the sciences, neuroscience. What else could the soteriological goal be?
Yeah, I do think that there's a part of the tendency of viewing traditional Buddhism is to think that everybody necessarily took it literally. And certainly there are those today who do and who have. But there's also, from my study now, admittedly a long time ago, that the understanding of how the cycle of rebirth plays out is not limited to the next lifetime. And that if we understand that as a metaphor, we can not, some people will want to see it literally, but we can also take it as a metaphor for understanding how we repeat our behaviors in shorter and shorter cycles of time. That it's not necessarily the outcome of an action in the next lifetime that we need to be concerned with, because in some sense, and in a very profound sense in terms of the teaching of no self, that need not be our concern. What is important to us is how, or the time cycle, if we shorten that, the effect of our decisions and actions today is also within that way of thinking about action and consequence. And if we realize that the actions we take now will have a consequence 20 years in the future on our life, 10 years, 5 years, next week, that the image of rebirth is more about, in my understanding, more about how actions that we take now have consequences. And we don't have to invoke some kind of metaphysical system of rebirth to realize the truth of that. Our actions now, our decisions now, our way of thinking about each other and things in the world now has consequences. And that's what I think we can take out of that idea of rebirth and use it in the present for our own lives. And so that's a way of reinterpreting some of these things in ways that are more useful, I believe, in the present than treating them as interesting mythology or interesting legends or interesting metaphysical speculations that those people over there who are traditional cling to somehow.
Mm-hmm.
These teachings, as bizarre and strange as they may appear to us in the present, meant something to somebody. And if we can be open to the full range of the Buddhist teachings, we can find a great richness for ourselves in those.
Okay, I'm going to go to some of the questions from our listeners. Just to start, there are many of them, so I'm just going to pick them as best I can. Anthony Valdez writes, are there any benefits to keeping the metaphysical, quoted, teachings of Buddhism? Many secular Buddhists claim it's spooky and not necessary to gain from the teachings of Buddhism.
Well, I think that I don't think we should throw anything away, which is a terribly conservative thing to say, I guess. I tend to think of my understanding as postmodern, in the sense that I don't want to prejudge the value of these teachings by what I think today. Certainly, my understanding of Buddhism has changed radically in the last half century. And what I value today is very different from what I valued 50 years ago. So the fact that I find things valuable today that are other than what I found valuable then, I think is, at least for me, conveys the message that there's a rich set of resources there. These things have been maintained and transmitted over centuries for some reason. Now, maybe we don't like all of it. Maybe there's part of it that makes sense for us now today. But that doesn't mean that the whole of it should be rejected because it doesn't match our expectations. If we think of practice as a discipline, it's what changes us, rather than we being the ones who say, oh, this is what I like, that's what I don't like, so I'm going to keep this and I'm going to throw that away. If we throw that away, we don't allow it to change us.
Okay, so the next question is along similar lines. I'll give you an opportunity to possibly rebut the premise of the question. Is it possible to strip out the mythology in Buddhism that might be a cultural artifact from a time in the past to arrive at the core tenets of modern Buddhism?
That way of talking about Buddhism as a core set of basically transcendent or transhistorical truths, in contrast to something that's purely cultural or merely cultural, is part of what the image of religion is that we were talking about earlier, about this notion of decay and revival. Everybody is always located. And the idea that there is some core teaching that can be separated from its cultural context is basically a way of saying, I have the power, the authority, the ability to make that judgment. I'm the one who's saying this is the core and we can discard that because it's merely cultural. Do we get to say that? Who gives us that authority? Certainly a lot of other people have said that other aspects of Buddhism are equally important to what we might choose. And so the presumption of the authority, the presumption of having the power to do that is part of what makes modern Western Buddhism so problematic in my mind. It's claiming, well, we know, we're the ones who know. Those people, those traditional people, they don't really understand what Buddhism is really about because they're clinging to these merely cultural forms. And we can see the separation between them. We know that it's okay to drink coffee and not to have to drink green tea. That's a really minor cultural difference. But the judgment about what is and isn't authentic and pure, that's a real assertion of power. It's a real assertion of authority. And we need to be able, as practitioners, to question that and to make judgments for ourselves.
Yeah, I would just ask, before I move on to our next question, Buddhism is culture. I don't know how you separate it from culture. But Ron Purser writes to us, one of our contributing writers, how does one discriminate or evaluate whether secularizing Buddhism is improvisational versus an evolutionary stage in the development of Buddhism, as Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi puts it? I can read it again if you like.
Yes, please.
How does one discriminate or evaluate whether secularizing Buddhism is improvisational versus an evolutionary stage in the development of Buddhism, as Bhikkhu Bodhi puts it?
I find it awkward to, first of all, I find it awkward to make that distinction because evolution happens as a, sorry, the contrasting term that Ron uses is what? Oh, improvisational. Evolution is an improvisational process. The two are not separate. What needs to be avoided, I think, is this notion that evolution is some kind of process that's happening and is leading in a certain direction. No, it's always an ongoing improvisation in the present moment. There's no evolutionary force directing what's happening with Buddhism. Everybody's making it up as we go along.
Okay, so we have another question from Anna-Laure Brousseau, somebody I've been in breakout groups with in other seminars. How to benefit from awareness of oppositional pairings? It seems that such limitations of understanding, e.g. fixations in progressive versus traditional practices, are integral to whole views, including social, political, aesthetic, spiritual, economic, kinds of oppositional pairings. How to use awareness of this fixed form in a way that opens up our whole views?
I think that what I would hope is that people see that these are necessarily connected, that these are not dichotomies, but rather that as we define one, we define the other. That to be spiritual versus being materialistic, for example, the strong value judgments that are inherent in those are defined by one another. And I will happily admit that much of my thinking on this goes back to reading the Tao Te Ching when I was a teenager. And at least the translation that I had at the time, the little old penguin version, convinced me that all of these are concepts and that concepts exist in relationship to one another. You have good because you have bad, you have inside because you have outside. And in the same way, we have traditionalizing and secularizing. We have progressive and regressive or conservative. We have modern and old-fashioned. All of these are connected to one another in a dynamic way because they're all concepts that we're using. They don't represent, they don't point to things in the world, but rather they are concepts, and as a consequence, they are part of a network intention of concepts that is itself dynamic. At one point, I talked about how these pairs then bridge across to one another, so that modern becomes an opposition to superstitious and so on. So it's not just the pairings, but it's the way then that the pairings are stacked and come to influence one another that I think we can become aware of and reflect on. And that's what it means to be critical about our engagement with the Buddhism that's being presented to us. Is to think about it and to understand what's implied by the very categories that are being used.
Okay, there's one more. We have time for one more question. I don't know if you can answer it in 2 minutes, but you can try. Kim Allen writes, within the religious aspect of Buddhism, there is some interaction with the Christian notion of religion, namely that it is a set of beliefs. But Buddhism is more an orthopraxy than orthodoxy. How does the existing backdrop of Christian or more broadly Abrahamic ideas influence the current process of secularization?
The very fact that so much of the way in which Buddhism is being understood, is being presented as a system of beliefs, is influenced by that background to the extent that we expect religion to tell us that these beliefs are ones that we should adopt for ourselves. And that notion that suffering, that Buddhism is a religion of suffering, people understood Buddhism as a religion that I should believe that my life is suffering, rather than understanding it as a description of what human life is like. And so that kind of descriptive orientation is very, very different from the notion that this is a set of orthodox beliefs that you must hold to and cling to. And that background, that inability to see Buddhist teachings as descriptive, and instead to see them as a set of doctrines that have to be adopted, is, I think, perhaps the most, for me, from my perspective, the most profound effect of Buddhism being in this kind of Christian culture.
Okay, I'm sorry we can't answer more of your questions. There's so many that have come in, but thank you, Richard, for being with us today. And
My pleasure, thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us on the call. We have another conversation coming up tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the racialized secularization of mindfulness with Funie Xu and Shenjing Han. We are providing these sessions for free, so if you want to help support us and our other efforts, please consider donating to tricycle.org/donate. And don't forget that you can receive a 30% discount off your copy of Secularizing Buddhism by clicking the link in the chat. I think our friend Carolyn will put that in the chat again. And that's it. I hope you continue with us to see the rest of the series. And Richard, thank you again. It's a great book. I urge everyone to have a look.
Thank you very much. I hope that they enjoy reading it.
Thank you. I certainly did.